Okay, hello and welcome everybody to today's event celebrating the opening of a brand new commission in our Scottish design galleries by artist and curator Swapnaa Tamhane. Welcome. I'm Meredith Moore. I'm one of the curators here, and I'd like to finally welcome Swapnaa back to Dundee. Welcome also our fellow panelists, Dr. Tiffany Boyle and Dr. Bashabi Fraser. And also to thank all of you so much for coming along to find out about what important conversations this work is going to open up for us in our galleries and as a museum. Today we have live British Sign Language available, provided by Sheena MacDonald and Georgina Donohoe. After I've just said a brief introduction, we're going to hear from each speaker for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion and there'll be a chance to ask some questions. Just to make you aware, the talk is being recorded, but the audience don't feature in the recording. So, to introduce the artist and this new work, Swapnaa Tamhane works to destabilise and untether colonial constructs. Based between Canada and India, she works with drawing, textiles, handmade paper, text, and sculpture. Her interest in craft and design led to the publication of Sar, The Essence of Indian Design, published by Verdant and co-written with Rashmi Varma. Today, we reveal a new work that she has created for V&A Dundee, exploring the context of jute during British colonialism. Inspired by research undertaken here in Dundee in 2018 at the University of Dundee Archives and at Verdant Works, which is part of Dundee Heritage Trust. In Dundee, the jute industry and its history can be felt everywhere. Many of today's residents are still connected to it through their parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles who worked in factories and mills to manufacture sacks, carpet backing, and other utilitarian products. From the 19th century, this industry was reliant on raw jute grown and harvested in Bengal, which was then a British colony, and it's now a region split between India and Bangladesh. By around 1900, the success of competitor jute mills in and around Calcutta, now Kolkata, is seen to have begun the decline of Dundee's industry. But the story is much more complex than this, because many of the Dundee mills were in fact owned and managed by Scots. Swapnaa's work responds to this often overlooked context, exploring how the colonial system connected workers across continents from Calcutta to Dundee. If you haven't seen the work yet in the galleries, I've just got some teaser images here for you. It comprises a huge collage of scanned images and drawings inspired by the archives, reflecting on the experiences of female jute industry workers in factories and in fields in and around Calcutta. You can also see microscopic images of jute fibres, which refer to Swapnaa's process of hand-making paper from jute. The collage is accompanied by a case filled with engraved mirrors. The mirrors bear extracts from a Hindustani language exercise book, also from the archives, and it contains key phrases that Scottish supervisors used to manage the Bengali workforce. This work reveals the colonial attitudes that characterise the jute mill compounds and asks us to consider our own relationship towards these attitudes and these histories. Today, we're going to have a chance to hear directly from Swapnaa about some of the thinking and making that has inspired this work. We are also joined by Dr. Tiffany Boyle, who very kindly introduced us at the museum to Swapnaa and who's co-curated the display with us. She is currently curator and exhibitions manager at Edinburgh Printmakers, as well as an independent curator and writer. In 2019, she co-founded Mother Tongue with collaborator Jessica Carden, producing exhibitions, film programmes, events, and texts. From 2016 to 21, she lectured in the Department of Design, History and Theory at Glasgow School of Art, and from March 2019 to 20 was a Hauser and Wirth Institute NY postdoctoral and senior scholar fellow. quite the mouthful. We are also joined by Dr. Bashabi Fraser, an academic and writer and close friend of the museum, being a member of our decolonising advisory group that have been working with us to rewrite interpretation in our galleries. She is Professor Emerita of English and Creative Writing and Director of the Scottish Centre of Tagore Studies at Edinburgh Napier University. Her research on the intertwined histories of Dundee and Calcutta and the jute industry inspired her epic poem From the Ganja to the Tay, published in 2009. Swapnaa's work for V&A Dundee couldn't have been created without collaboration with a huge number of individuals and organisations. And I particularly want to mention the University of Dundee Archives and also Verdant Works, who have worked in partnership with us on this commission. This is a really complex history to unpack, and it's been invaluable having access not only to their collections, but also to their expertise while developing this work and everything that accompanies it. I'm really excited to say that after this talk, between 4 and 5 next door in the Western Studio, we have the opportunity to see some of the original photographs and documents that have inspired this artwork. And it's a real teaser of the expansive collections that are available in the city, and there will be archivists on hand to answer your questions about these. So, I think that's enough from me initially. I'll hand over to Tiffany, who's going to kick off the presentations.
Thanks. Yeah, that's me. Thank you so much, Meredith. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the V&A and thank you to Swapnaa and Bashabi. Following Meredith's introduction, I'm a curator and a writer, and today I want to speak to Swapnaa's work and its interrogation of jute through talking about paper milling in Scotland and the British Linen Bank. The research underpinning my involvement here today has personal origins for me. I grew up in a small town called Bonnyrigg in Midlothian, which is one of the smallest council areas in Scotland situated between Edinburgh and the borders. It's an area historically very industry orientated, with the river north and southwest running through it, and there were 2 main trades, coal mining and paper milling. The county has never had a public art gallery, and this was something maybe around 2016, 2017. I'd been working in the arts for some years, and I was really trying to grapple with this lack of arts in this area that I'm from. So I began to take a series of kind of research walks along the river, trying to map out the historical presence of the paper mills, thinking perhaps of a future artist book project. I thought I would give a little bit context to Mother Tongue, which is the curatorial duo that I've worked as part of for a number of years. Our projects often respond to identity, language and belonging. We've also produced a number of projects which have engaged in different ways with Scotland's colonial past. So, for example, in this slide is a shot from an exhibition, Rum Retort, which took place in 2016. It was curated with Natalia Palombo, and this was at the Tobacco Warehouse in Greenock, which brought together artists from Scotland and the Caribbean, querying the historic ties through trade and slavery and contemporary calls for reparations. And in a similar vein, in 2018, we curated a solo exhibition titled Code Switching and Other Work from Montreal-based First Nations artist Nadia Mir, which in part looked at local production and use of clay tobacco pipes as a byproduct of Scotland's colonial trade in tobacco. I think it wouldn't be inaccurate to say that the 2014 Commonwealth Games held in Glasgow were a major impetus for a much broader, more public conversation around Scotland's colonial past and role in empire. However, I've been wondering if some of the conversations we're having perhaps focus on the products that were traded in a very big way, so notably tobacco, rum, sugar, or they're around specific things like architecture or particular wealthy families, which is all very important. But I think that the downside of that is that this can cause us to lose sight of the manner in which these trades and businesses were interconnected, or overshadow some of the lesser known products and materials very much intertwined, say cotton or linen. So I guess that's some of the background context to what I might say. So in 2019, after taking these research walks, I was invited to write a text for a newspaper project titled Remnants, produced by the Glasgow-based design duo Panel, who had in turn been commissioned by the architectural collective Voices of Experience and the gallery Civic Room, which is housed in a former British Linen Bank building on the High Street in Glasgow. And part of the project brief was to rethink in a feminist and decolonial lens the building and the immediate locale of Civic Room, which is at the edge of the merchant city. And when I first met with Panel, I said, I've been taking these walks over a couple of years along the River Esk, and I think there's a connection here that I'd like to explore. And so I began that in the archives of the British Linen Bank, which are now with Lloyds Bank, and those archives are on the western outskirts of Edinburgh. And so some of the following slides and information comes from writing that text. So as I mentioned, the River North and South Esk runs through Midlothian, and they're the site of, in different ways, these industries, coal and paper milling. So the river was used to power the paper mills. The last of these closed in 2004. Paper milling in the county dates back to 1709, and Midlothian was to prove a strategic location for a real density of paper mills which sprung up along the Esk. It was close enough to Edinburgh to have a ready workforce, a captive market for its paper and coal, and close enough to procure the linen rags needed in early paper production. But it was far enough away that the polluting byproducts of the trade didn't afflict Edinburgh itself. Paper milling at this time was an industry in which women could be employed. They made up a large segment of the workforce alongside young boys, although they were paid less than their male counterparts. Paper produced in Midlothian, as just two examples, was used to print the novels of Sir Walter Scott and some of the earliest banknotes of the British Linen Company at the Springfield Valley Mill in the town of Poulton. Historically, paper produced in the United Kingdom was made from the pulp of washed, shredded and beaten rags of linen and cotton. The rags were collected by rag and bone men or rag pickers who would sell them on to a middleman or, depending on the location, directly to the paper makers. The paper-making industry was dependent on this trade until the mid-1800s, when wood pulp began to be used, and then from the 1860s, esparto grass was imported from North Africa. Following pulping, the mixture was diluted down with water, transferred to a vat, where a vatman would then extract pulp with a square meshed mould. Following some shaking, this would form paper, which then needed surplus water to be squeezed out. And if the paper was going to be used for writing, there was then a thin coating that was applied. This was dried and pressed, and then stacked as reams for sale. The quality of early papermaking proved problematic, as did the production of its raw material linen. Linen is produced from flax, an annual plant which, depending on the variety as it approaches maturity, flowers in either blue, which produced really fine, good quality fibres, or white, which is stronger, coarser fabric. Harvesting flax is done right down to the root, with the seed heads removed as quickly as possible afterwards using a coarse, spiky comb. And linen, as maybe some people in the room will know, had as a trade, as an industry, a real route around Dundee, along, to Montrose, etc. An ancient fabric, linen production in 18th century Europe was dominated by Germany, Holland, France, and Russia. Its monetary worth at this time can be demonstrated by the fact that imports were often split into multiple shipments to try and mitigate against the risk of shipwrecks. The historian Alistair Drury has described that in the early efforts to birth a linen industry in Scotland, and more widely the UK, that the route taken to do so was one of imitation rather than trying to forge new methods or technologies. So quite similar to paper, that these techniques came from elsewhere and we simply stole, begged, borrowed, however you want to frame that. So apprentices were sent abroad to learn trade secrets, and groups of foreign weavers were stationed in the UK to give impetus to the industry's development. Neither were to prove very successful, and the British Linen Company was then able to kind of learn from those mistakes at the moment of its founding. So this is Civic Room on the High Street in Glasgow in the former British Linen Bank. So this is the kind of the top of the building and a decorative plaque that lines the side. So the British Linen Company took the Greek goddess of wisdom, crafts, weaving, war and cultivation of the olive trees, Pallas Athena, as its emblem, her presence gracing all their banknotes after being agreed upon for their seal at their very first meeting of the directors on the 2nd of August in 1746. The mandate of the British Linen Company to do everything that might conduce to promote the manufacture of linen was given royal sanction to establish itself in the same year. This mandate was quite short-lived, with the company transitioning from 1763 onwards towards banking, providing finance to the linen industry, and then from 1767 to entities out with the linen trade. Although it was not until 1906 that it became known as the British Linen Bank. So it was, after being set up to promote linen, really quickly transitioned essentially into being a bank. Despite being a Scottish-based enterprise, they avoided using Scottish or North British in its name to avoid connotations with the Jacobite rebellion, which was not yet a distant memory. Their desire to promote linen was not singular, but was tied to colonial expansion into the so-called New World, made easier, as described by Drury, by the 1742 Bounty Act, which gave a subsidy upon the export of British coarse linens, although this was withdrawn within a decade. Sacking and sailcloths were also produced locally in linen, items that facilitated trade with the colonies. Where the purchaser in the Caribbean or North America was not able to pay for goods in cash, other forms of remuneration that were accepted included cotton, sugar and rum for barter. The coarse linen exported west from Scotland for slaves called osnaburgs was given once or twice a year as a clothing allowance by the plantation owner for the wearers themselves to sew into clothes. Through this trade, many in Scotland profited indirectly from slavery, and those who amassed wealth invested it to different ends. The remaining architecture surrounding the Civic Room in Glasgow in the Merchant City being just one testament to such commerce and exchange. One of the first things after writing this text that I went on to do was to produce an artist book with curator Natalia Palombo and musician K.S. Bancoli. And this artist book project is forthcoming in 2022. It was titled Delineate. And I want to close here with a couple of anecdotes, one which comes from one of the invited writers, Beldina Ondenio-Onassis, who performed under the name here of the Curse and sadly passed away last year. But she mentioned in her research the historical representation of trades and materials at the British Parliament, particularly the fact that whilst cotton and linen had representatives lobbying in double figures, jute had just 2 representatives at Westminster. And in a very different trail of thought, a couple of weeks ago, I was in the archive of the artist and writer Alistair Gray, and the custodian of the archive, Sorcha Dallas Gray, was showing me a ledger that he'd found discarded in the street in the 1950s, and he'd picked it up to take home because it had many empty pages, and he used it as a sketch pad, as drawing paper. And she said, because this was something that was still really expensive in the 1950s, paper wasn't something that we had at our disposal. And it's been something that I've been thinking of because in many respects, beyond wondering, should I print this? Is this a very eco decision for sustainability? The price point of paper has changed in a way that its value has become a lot more commonplace to us. It's in our everyday. And I think that what's captured my attention in Swapnaa's work for so long is that she makes her caddy paper from jute by hand before drawing, before printing, in a manner that then doesn't allow us to forget the surface onto which her work is made, bringing into focus the materials, production methods, and histories under interrogation here. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, Tiffany, Bashabi, and Meredith. So Meredith, Moore, along with Francesca Beebe and Tiffany, have been kind of the curators of this commission. And thank you for welcoming me in Dundee. I'm starting with this image here, which you can read, says colonial jute products on the door. And it's a door that I walk past every day, and it's on my way to my studio, which is on the second floor. This is on the first floor. And my studio building is in Montreal. So I never noticed this door sign until a year later when I was moving out of that studio around the corner. So that kind of ground floor with the big windows is where colonial jute products was. And then I just moved around the corner, and then there it was, this sign that was quite apparent. And there's now a publishing house that has kind of taken over and runs very cool events. And I should have nabbed the sign when I had the opportunity to, but I didn't. What's so sort of spooky or serendipitous about this colonial jute product sign is that I had sort of spent, a very kind of long summer in a dark editing suite working on a moving image piece that was incorporating a lot of the archival images that I was looking at the University of Dundee. And that piece is titled Ghosts, and I haven't quite done anything with it, but it was my kind of starting point for this larger body of work. So I just wanted to have you have that in mind. So I was initially working with this photograph of these two men and this bale of jute that I came across at the jute mill archives. And I was thinking about this bale as a sort of portal or whirlpool that could, suck you inside of it and transport you or carry you towards these histories and these peoples. And I'm just playing around with some of the images here. And that surface is handmade jute paper that I made. And just sort of cutting them out and creating these collages, but also wanting to animate them. And then, of course, there are these incredible photographs from the archives where these look like very kind of constructed and planned images in the mills, where, as you know, were predominantly full of women and children who were the key laborers, and then contrasted to the photographs. So these are from the archives. And then contrasted, when I was looking at the photographs of India, they were primarily men, and more difficult. It was more difficult for me to find images of women working in the Indian context. So just as some background, as Tiffany briefly mentioned, I have been working with khadi. So khadi is hand-spun, hand-loom cotton, and it's sort of what Mahatma Gandhi had introduced as a way to reclaim a process of making one's own clothes in, sort of resistance to the fact that the entire textile industry had been moved to Manchester and Lancashire. And my practice is mostly focused on drawing. So it naturally made sense for me to start thinking about the surface of what I was drawing on. What is my substrate, my foundation? And it was for me in wanting to query a relationship to materials and materiality. I'm also interested in what a decolonial gesture could be, and I became interested in hand-making paper with khadi and then jute, both of which I could trace back to India, where my family is originally from. And I could trace them back to materials that are linked to imperial and global economics before and after independence from British colonialism. In the process of making paper, the grid of the warp and weft are completely untethered. The fibers are filabrated and macerated so that they can accept water. And the structure of the fiber changes in that process. And I'm really interested in that action. It's super nerdy, and I get really into it when I'm making paper. Because it's a very long process, and you're sort of with the pulp for, anywhere from 2 to 7 hours. And for all of my handmade jute paper, I was just using tree wrapping material from the local hardware store. So with the Indian jute production that's now all for export, I just wanted a very accessible material. I don't know why I'm pointing at the screen. Where should I point? Magically. Anyways, so this is the tree wrapping material. And then you have to take it and then boil it with caustic soda, and then, rinse it with lots of water. And then that's the paper that is made. So this is what it looks like when I'm working with the pulp. And then this is raw jute that I purchased in Delhi. So, and then that's just looking through a microscope. As the fibers are beaten down in the Hollander beater, the fibers actually form a new bind that are completely arbitrary. So I became really obsessed with this idea of like a grid coming apart and then these kind of new binds forming. So this microscopic view is from the handmade paper now with all the water pressed out. And I like to think of this as chaos on a microscopic level, or anarchy, or resistance to order, a resistance to another set of rules, resistance to another form of thinking. And for me, it becomes a metaphor to a resistance to colonialism. So I was initially interested in how Dundee in Scotland became the primary center for the production of jute, beginning in 1838, and held the world's monopoly until 1890, when Calcutta or Kolkata then became the main producer and processor, and that led to the demise of the Dundee industry, as you know. I was interested in how great wealth decayed in Dundee even while under British colonialism, when they were essentially decimating the Indian textile industry, which prior to British colonialism held 23% of the world's economy, and then after, -2%. When the Calcutta industry started in 1855 along just a strip of land that was 60 miles long and 2 miles wide, they rapidly became the leading supplier. And this success led to an anti-Calcutta rhetoric in Scotland, as Dundee faced the extinction of its own jute industry, referring to Calcutta as the Indian Dundee. The Indian historian Dipesh Chakrabarti studies ideas of discipline, authority, protest, solidarity, and organization of the jute mill workers in Calcutta. These workers were initially Bengali, but quickly became a migrant group, mostly untouchables or scheduled caste, what is now called Dalits. They would have been artisans of declining crafts or cultivators with no land. They were the lowest paid of industrial workers in India, which is seen through their poverty, housing, health, and chronic indebtedness. On the other side, there was more protection given to the Indian laborers by the British than there was to mill workers in Dundee, as Jim Tomlinson writes. Jute dominated the economic life of Bengal, going between agricultural, mercantile, and manufacturing sectors. With changes in agrarian economies, many women were forced to work outside the household to supplement resources, but were paid less than the women who worked in the mills. The historian Samita Sen looks at the rural working class involved in the jute industry, as it straddled the urban and the rural. Often peasants engaged their entire family in cultivating raw jute, as we can see in that one photograph that I showed, of which Bengal's own factories were the key consumers. The rural economy therefore helped to sustain the industrial working class generationally through women and children's labor. Samita Sen suggests that any study by labor historians has focused primarily on organized industrial workers who are mostly men and single migrants. However, gender is embedded in the very fabric of the labor process. Between 1890 and 1940 in India, women formed 12 to 17% of the total workforce. Through the growth of the industry and unionization, women were excluded from labor organizations. In the mills, arguments of lack of skill and family responsibility were used to place women in lower paid jobs. Sen says that gender relations are deeply capitalist through recruitment and gender ghettos that were enforced in the mills because women's labor and earnings were perceived as supplementary to the household. The women who did work in the factories were often widows, or women who left marriages or were abandoned. Working class women were seen as promiscuous, and the urban poor was seen as immoral under both colonial law and the Hindu elite. They were often blamed for immoralities, venereal diseases, and deviance. The 19th century term for widows and prostitutes was the singular rar, R-A-R-H, which then became separated and distinct. So widows were then termed bidaba, and prostitutes were termed beshya. If a woman was outside of her role as mother, daughter, sister, or wife, she was outcast, and the space outside of the home was the space of the beshya, to quote Sen. The working class also refused conformity to the ideal family that was espoused by the elite Hindu, who often enforced their own ideas on them, attempting to quash divorce, widow remarriage, concubinage, or polygamy, for instance. So the work that I have made for this commission for the Scottish Design Galleries is a collage that incorporates drawings and photographs of women who are working both in the urban and rural environments, with a series of layers of these microscopic views of the handmade jute paper. I wanted those incredible fibers to be blown up to this magnitude. And over the last week, I've spent 3 days drawing into the collage. So as you walk around it, you'll notice there's graphite on it. Within the collage, I've also incorporated a still from the movie The River, directed by Jean Renoir in the early 1950s, with the opening scenes that include raw jute coming down the river, with nameless so-called background actors who are actually truly laborers, and no translations of what they are saying. The subtitles, for instance, say, "Man shouts in Indian language," "Man speaks in Indian language." And just as a background, the film was the first Technicolor film to be made in India, with filmmakers like Satyajit Ray working on that. And I like this relationship to the river, particularly where the V&A is sitting along the River Tay. So I've been using this album from the Dundee Heritage Trust, which includes these images. And I spent some time, so you'll notice this one, I've done a drawing of these 3 women who were sorting the jute bags, and then I've translated that into a photolithograph. So I spent some time, this is my kind of process of printing out these images on just kind of basic printing paper, cutting them out, and starting to think about how I wanted to place them for this large collage. So that's a detail of this piece. I just quite like them, and I was sort of trying to think about how, because these histories are so unrecorded, I was trying to think about who these women were, what their stories might have been, where they might have come from, how did they land up in this environment. And I was thinking that, if they're wearing a white sari, they might have been a widow. There were also protests from the lower classes against sati, which is, like widow immolation, when the widow is also supposed to die with her husband, who was considered her god. So I was really looking, I liked how they I was just thinking about, or imagining, trying to think about who they might have been. And I found the one in the middle quite sort of fierce and, has quite a lot of personality, even in this blurry black and white photograph. And these 2 women who are also in the larger collage, I was thinking that they might be Adivasis or tribals who would have been maybe pushed out of their land through deforestation, which was happening through colonialism, but is also continuing to happen now in states like Chhattisgarh. And there's a huge kind of Marxist sort of uprising around that. So for me, they're also contemporary figures. They're not just from the past. And just as a side note, the colors I've used, I've really tried to counter how archival images are created and how we kind of read them. And so I've used these sort of like punchier, bright colors that aren't necessarily like, kitschy Indian colors, but sort of sit in this like liminal state between being, particularly this one, like being a kind of bright, weird fuchsia pink. The second part of this commission is titled Tum Bagla Mat Bolom Hum Kuch Nahin Samajhte Hai. In brackets, you don't speak Bengali, I can't understand anything, which includes 28 mirrors that have text from a language exercise book called Hindustani for Jute Mill Workers, published in 1947, the year of partition and independence. And that's the book, which is in the archives. And when I first read the examples to be practiced or translated, I thought they really kind of revealed an attitude towards labor, a sense of distrust, a sort of perpetual ordering around, and a kind of constant surveillance. So you can see also the words that were being taught to then be translated also kind of reveal that attitude. And for me, it was clear that there was nothing really about a culture or about understanding the different religious groups that were working in this industry. Instead, it was really about, getting the job done. So these have been sandblasted onto the backs of the mirrors. And the size of the mirrors is quite specific. They're 3x7. And they mimic the size of museum labels. I've been thinking much about how labels and what their role is in the space of a museum. So museums are institutions that collect, organize, describe, and explain. And in my work, I'm resisting how anthropological and ethnographic structures of classification and consumption operate, and how the museum label enacts a kind of violence in explaining, people from my culture, for instance, and how the museum label also enacts a kind of self-portraiture. It's taking objects from a place and it's explaining it to you in a language that you're going to understand. So this is why I've used mirrors. The label, the description, the language, the style of writing, the way of translating the other into a communicable concept is an enduring act of colonial legacy that is just recently being called into question. And I'm thinking of the Pitt Rivers Museum, for instance, who are doing a lot of kind of work to reevaluate their displays. The mirrors, therefore, include text samples from this language exercise book, and you will see your own reflection in them as you read them. And the mirrors are sitting on, so these are some of the examples. And they're sitting on a large sheet of handmade jute paper that also has embedded raw jute and dyed pigment pulp. And I will end there. Thank you. That's far more than 10 minutes. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Tiffany, and hear me. Thank you, Tiffany and Swapna and Meredith, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming. I must say it's a real pleasure to work with VNA, with all this vision, and it's just fascinating listening to your work as well. And how do I come into this? As Meredith has said, that I'm an academic, a poet, and I've also been a Royal Literary Fund Fellow in Dundee University for 5 years. So it's been wonderful. And I miss those journeys, along the Tay and the sea. I grew up in Bengal, and which is a riverine state where the jute grows. I've seen the jute. And that's the city where I spent some years in as a child, and later on in life when I was a student and when I was teaching in Calcutta University, Calcutta, I have seen jute growing there. And what struck me was how tall this crop was. As children, we would never play there because even tigers could hide there, I guess. But that's just not really true. But uh, and then how did I come to the whole jute industry? But because it was part of my life. My mother, both my parents were academics. They had been researchers at London School of Economics. And my father was actually the first Commonwealth scholar from India. And I came as a child with them to London. And they were both urban geographers, but they were also, my mother was a climatologist, and my father and mother specialized in human geography. And that's where a lot of my interest led me to the whole idea of cropland and cash crops and empire and exports and imports and what it did to India and the world. In the other thing that, because my mother was very climate conscious, I heard of climate change ages ago. We didn't have any Persian carpets or Afghan carpets in our house. We had jute carpets. She thought of them as biodegradable. She felt they could be, they could be used and then replaced, and it would keep the industry going. We use jute bags. In fact, I'm carrying one today, and my husband too is carrying another today. And I skipped a lot, and those skipping ropes were made of jute. So jute was part of my life, a durable product. And then when I came to do my PhD in Edinburgh University, part of it was fascinating because I had supervisor in Calcutta University and I had two supervisors in Edinburgh University. And I realized that my supervisor's father had actually come to study at the paper technology in Scotland. So there were links there already. And that's when I started, because I married a Scotsman that's another story. When you fall in love, you can't do anything. You just follow whoever you love. And though I didn't want to leave India, I did. I left a job. I was an only child. And then I started taking interest in the Scottish Indian links of a shared history. But it began long ago because my grandfather had a Scotsman who actually adopted him, not as his child, but because my grandfather's father had died very young, he educated him. And his wife really was very fond of him. And my grandfather remembers having treacle and apple and was tempted to come with them to Scotland, but he didn't want to, because he still had responsibilities. So it began there in the land, in Bengal, the land of rivers, this link with the Scotsman and my parents coming here and then me coming to Scotland. And that's when I started studying the links, I realized that the rivers told a huge story. My land of rivers was where it all began, where shipping, the piling of bales, the sending them to Dundee, and then I felt that the two rivers could speak to each other. And I'm forgetting about this. I'm really not good at all this. And and that's when I started studying the links between the two rivers, the Ganga, as we call it in India, Ganges as in English, and the Tay. I came across the fact that in Shamnagar is one of the mills that the Dundonians first established their mill in Srirampur as far back as 1838, and it all began then. In my research, I, like you, Swapna, I depended on the Dundee University archives. And it was marvelous what going underground there takes you to the basement, takes you to the archaeological facts of history. And I looked at the personal narratives of the jute-wallas who were in Bengal, and the photographs many of which you have used. And I think the whole idea of the mother tongue comes across, doesn't it, in the use of Bengali and other Indian languages. I also, this is what keeps taking me back, the riverfront. And I have seen bales being piled onto ships there, coming on trains and trolleys and bullock carts, and there they are. But I also really admired the legacy and the history that is held in Verdant works. So I keep coming back to Verdant works, and I think my 5 years in Dundee also helped me with that. But what was the position? There is always the two cities, Calcutta or Kolkata and Dundee. We know that they never prospered at the same time. It was a seesaw relationship. When one prospered, the other went down. But there is this idea that because Calcutta finally took over, that Dundonian workers lost out. But we must remember who was responsible for that. The Dundonians themselves, who bought up mills, found it easier, cheaper to manufacture where the crop grew. So it's interesting how the Scots actually controlled the whole industry. I must also, another thing that struck me was, coming from Bengal, I found that two industries which were dominated by Scots were jute and tea. And they would, and right from the foreman to the manager to the salesman, they were all Dundonians, Scots, and the tea industry was the same. But they were not Oxford, Oxbridge, and Sandhurst educated. They were not considered empire builders, but they were skilled technicians. They took tremendous pride in their work. And though they were not considered quite pakka as sahibs, they held the insider outsider status within India. And that was very interesting in my own archival research. The other thing that also struck me was the mill compound life was very, very real. And I think I should go back to the mill compound if I can find. Yes. So there you see a mill. And there it was quite, if you have read Eugenie Fraser's book, Home on the Hooghly, it was a really hierarchical society where the junior officers' wives could not visit the senior officers' wives, and the salesman was the top, was almost like the highest peak, Mount Everest. So there was a caste class system existing, but what was interesting was the children played together, both Indian and Scottish, within the compound, and that came out in all the conversations that were recorded. And I just want to go back. Where am I? Victoria Jute Mill. Sorry. And that led me to write this epic poem, From the Ganga to the Tay. And I called it purposely Ganga because that's what we call her, and she calls herself the Ganga. Both the rivers speak, by the way. And I'm so glad you have this whole gendered approach, Swapna, in your work, because the Ganga is feminine. She's the mother goddess, and Tay is masculine, pragmatic. So while one is romantic and impetuous, the other is practical and grounded, if rivers can be called grounded. But anyway, on the page, if you open the book, it flows on the page like a river, so it's a concrete poem. But the voices are not mine. They're the voices of the river about a shared history. This book was actually enacted, staged in Glasgow and in Calcutta. I would love to see it staged in Dundee and in Calcutta, to again have this skein of the jute thread woven between the two cities. which tie the history of the cities together. Later on, I went on to contribute to this book, The Scottish Jutewala, A Study of Transnational Positioning. That's when, looking through it through a post-colonial lens, which we all share, we all are post-colonialists. We're all post-colonials, aren't we? It's post-empire. So, and that's when I realized how the Scottish Jutewala could not actually enter the very the elitist clubs of Tullygunge Club and Bengal Club. So they could go to Calcutta Swimming Club, but not the Tolly. So that's quite interesting. The other interesting thing that I learned was how the women couldn't work. As you were saying, women couldn't work in the mills, but they could work in Calcutta, they could work in the fields. And it was the same with the officers' wives, the jutewalas' wives. They were looked down upon if they worked. So that became another interesting finding for me. And what was also interesting was how generations of Scots worked in India and in the jute industry. So it wasn't just something that they picked up their bags, went to Dundee, where they could rise up the social ladder very quickly, get promotions, and have a good lifestyle. It was also because a grandfather or a great uncle or a father had been there. We forget how many Scots spent time in India, through the generations. I'm just going to give you one or two figures, if I can. Sorry, I'm just moving forward without realizing it. There were as many as 1,000 jutewalas in Calcutta, while there were 130 mills operating in Dundee between 1850 and 1839. As we know that the first, the story of jute is told in Verdant works that first Dundee produced flax, and when whale oil was discovered, then jute, which could soften the fiber with which you make so much paper, bless you, then they turned to jute, which was much more lucrative. The other thing that happened was the Crimean War, 1853 to 56, that's when everything turned, that it was considered more pragmatic to produce the product where it was grown. So, and one more thing that happened was World War II was when, by that time, jute was no longer being transported right across the world. But while it was a global product, and I love the way the local and the global, and you mentioned the rural and the urban, in which you have the growing fields and the factories where people work. It was interesting how jute was a global fiber because of the Scottish network of industry, of economics. So jute could be exported right across to America, to Australia, through the global Scottish network. And when World War II happened, the slump happened as well. My own question about jute is that, it's not sophisticated, but like silk. It's not it's not comfortable like cotton. It's not fashionable like linen. Then why jute? Because it's durable, it's environmental friendly. This is the time. Times are changing. Climate change is knocking on our door, and I hope the V&A can have an outlet in which our skipping ropes and our carpets and everything, not just packaging, not just jute bags, but would you like to have a bag like that? I would. And there we are. This is all jute. Can you see the colors? You were talking about colors earlier. And here we are, the splash of colors. We used coasters and placemats and baskets, all made of jute. I even have a jute sari that was given to me, which is like raw silk. I'm not saying V&A should have a shop outlet to sell saris, but there are many other things that can be sold. And how's that? Sandals, tapestries, and when you have guests coming to your house, you can serve them peanuts and almonds in those little things. So for me, jute is the answer to the world economy reviving a product which is durable, which is may not be as sexy as we would like it to be, but you've seen all those colorful products. But I also want to stress one more thing before I go, and that is the partition of India in 1947 created mindless borders. And what happened in the east in Bengal was it cut through and created the rural-urban divide and economically destroyed the industry, because the growing lands were in what became East Pakistan and later Bangladesh, and the factories were in West Bengal, and Bengal was divided. So could we bring them all together through the rivers, through the story of the rivers, Dundee and Kolkata, the Tay and the Ganga, and with jute as the connecting fabric? Maybe we can through V&A. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to have to admit to being quite a terrible chair in that I have just been enjoying the conversation so much that I have let us run on far longer than we expected to. So we don't have any time for much more discussion, but we do hopefully have time for a couple of questions, if there are any burning questions from the audience. There's so many connecting threads in everything you have all been discussing. And I think one of the things that I've been struck by working on this with you, Swapnaa, is a lot of the emphasis we've put on trying to shift narratives in our galleries have been about, when thinking about decolonizing a story, are these big global networks, these, capitalism and the impact of these big forces, whereas actually your work touches on those things, but it does it by thinking about people's experiences, really using those archives to let us see and imagine those people. And archives are a way of letting us get closer to those people, because as you've said, they're absent from lots of other types of records. I just wondered if you had any more to say on that as we kind of close out the discussion today.
Yeah, I mean, all of my work is about looking at untold stories. So in my curatorial work, that's something I really focus on, is how to rejig the story of art, how to bring in the histories that are missing, but also how to look at art not through a Western mode of understanding how images are made. And in my artwork, that's something I really think about a lot. You spend hours alone making pulp or in the studio or working on these drawings. And I think about that very carefully, of how can I construct an image in a way that is sort of resisting how I'm supposed to do it, or how we're taught to draw, for instance. And even just thinking about a history of drawing, like, the drawing was introduced as a technical skill to also separate people from each other, both in the UK and also in India. So drawing was introduced in these kind of technical schools, and the kind of education that was. So my father studied architecture in one of these kind of technical schools, and it was not to elevate them, but it was to be a better worker for the British Raj. Like those were. So I'm just thinking about all that kind of background as I'm working through archives like this, or I'm working through yeah, just wanting to think about, what are we not looking at, or what do we not know about, and also how to be a little resistant as well. So all of my work is focused on that, and I think these are just kind of characters as well, but they're also, yeah, I'm really sensitive to the lived experience. What is that lived experience? And when I read that they might have been artisans who were removed from their craft, that their craft is no longer required, and you think, well, now they have to look for other work. What was that process for them to lose their trade, or their kind of the thing that they're good at with their hands, to now working in this kind of industry where it obviously looked quite challenging. And there's one particular archival photograph where there's just one woman, and it's an entire go down of just men. And so you think about her experience at that time as well, to, the kind of comments that might have been made, or just the kind of derogatory way that she might have been even regarded by them.
Thank you. That's really great to hear that sort of extra reflection. So sadly, I think we've run out of time. But the good news is we're going to be sticking around next door in the Western Studio, where we have objects from the University of Dundee Archives and Verdant Works that have been brought here for you to come and have a look at. And we'll be there very happy to chat to anybody who wants to come and say hello. Thank you all so much for coming along today. We've got a really diverse programme at V&A Dundee. You can find out about more events on our What's On pages. Hope to see you again. Thank you all so much. Thank you.